Imagine dedicating every breath, every coin, every heartbeat to raise a child, only to be repaid with betrayal. I'm Margaret, 65 years old, and I thought my daughter was my safe place. For decades, I worked 3 jobs, sold family heirlooms, and sacrificed every dream so she could have hers. Last Valentine's Day, I set the table with her favorite roast, expecting laughter and stories. Instead, she walked in with her husband, carrying papers that would erase my name from my own home. They called it care, but it was eviction wrapped in fake smiles. Within hours, I was in a nursing home, stripped of my freedom. But what they didn't know was I had a secret plan. And when I struck back, I wouldn't just reclaim my life. I'd expose every lie they'd ever told. The aroma of rosemary and garlic drifted through my small kitchen, wrapping the air in the same warmth I'd been trying to give my daughter for the past 40 years. My hands worked slowly but steadily, basting the roast with care, letting the juices run golden over the meat. It was Helen's favorite, had been since she was a little girl in braids, peeking over the counter to watch me cook. I paused for a moment, wiping my hands on my apron, and let my eyes wander around the room. Every inch of this house told a story. The oak dining table where Helen had done her homework, the wallpaper I'd chosen when she was 6, with little sunflowers she used to trace with her tiny fingers, the faded armchair where my late husband, Robert, would sit in the evenings, quietly listening as I told him about my day. This house wasn't just wood and nails, it was the backbone of every sacrifice I had made. I was only 24 when Robert died in that factory accident. One moment, I was a wife with plans for a summer trip. The next, I was a widow with a 4-year-old daughter and a mortgage I could barely manage. I learned to stretch $1 until it screamed. Days at the textile mill, nights cleaning offices, weekends baking pies for the farmer's market. I sold the small plot of land Robert's parents had given us as a wedding gift. Land we once dreamed of building a cottage on, just to pay for Helen's school uniforms and textbooks. There were moments I wanted to quit. Moments when the exhaustion gnawed so deep into my bones, I thought I'd collapse on the spot. But then Helen would bring home a drawing from school, 2 stick figures holding hands labeled me and mommy, and I would find the strength again. By the time she reached high school, I was working 3 jobs. The mornings began at the mill, afternoons at a bakery, and evenings scrubbing floors in an office building that smelled of stale coffee and printer ink. I missed birthdays, school plays, and even her prom night because I was folding laundry for strangers, just to keep the lights on at home. But it paid off. Helen got into university, her first choice. I remember the day the acceptance letter came. She stood in the doorway, her eyes wide, her voice shaking as she read the words aloud. I cried harder than I had since Robert's funeral, tears of pride mixing with the exhaustion that had become my constant companion. I sold Robert's watch to help with tuition, the gold one his father had given him when he turned 21. It was the last thing I had of his that still worked, but it bought Helen's first semester's books. Through it all, I never doubted that one day, when the years had worn me thin and my body slowed, Helen would be there. That was the unspoken promise between us. I would give her everything I had, and in my old age, she would make sure I wasn't alone. Now, as I set the table with the good china, I imagined how tonight would go. She had called earlier, her voice unusually warm, saying she and Paul would stop by for Valentine's Day dinner. I told myself this meant she missed me, that maybe she remembered the old traditions. I'd even bought a small box of chocolates to surprise her. Outside, the sky deepened to a soft twilight, the first stars peeking out. I lit a candle on the table, letting the flicker dance across the wine glasses. My knees ached as I moved, but I ignored it. The aches and pains were nothing new. They were just part of being 65, part of the long road I'd traveled. I thought of Robert again. He'd always said, "Maggie, life's about giving more than you take." I had lived by that. Every penny earned, every dream delayed, it was all for Helen. The clock on the wall ticked toward 7. My heart fluttered with anticipation. I smoothed my hair, adjusted my sweater, and checked the roast one last time. Perfect. When the doorbell finally rang, I felt a rush of warmth. I imagined Helen's smile, the way she used to wrap her arms around me. I pictured Paul being polite for once, maybe even bringing flowers. I didn't know that in just a few minutes, the ground beneath my life would crack wide open. For now, though, I opened the door with the same love I'd carried for decades, ready to welcome the daughter I had built my entire world around. The letter lay open on the kitchen counter, my handwriting looping across the page like a ribbon of my own history. "Robert," I began, as I had 100 times in the years since you left me. "Helen's coming for Valentine's dinner tonight. I made your rosemary roast. Remember how she used to sneak into the kitchen to steal the crispy edges? I think she's finally slowing down with work. Maybe she's ready to spend more time here again. I miss you every day, but seeing her will feel like having a piece of you back." I folded the page gently, pressing it between the pages of the old recipe book you had given me on our first anniversary. The candlelight made the gold lettering on the cover glow. For a moment, my chest swelled with the same hope I had carried all day. When the door opened, Helen stepped inside in a rush of perfume and cool winter air, Paul trailing behind her with his usual guarded expression. She didn't remove her coat or even glance at the roast resting proudly in the center of the table. "Mom, can we sit down for a minute?" Her tone was flat, businesslike. I frowned but nodded, wiping my hands on my apron. "Of course. Dinner's ready." "This won't take long," Paul interrupted, pulling a manila folder from his briefcase and setting it on the table between the wine glasses. The clink of metal clasps against the wood felt jarring, out of place. Helen drew a deep breath. "Mom, we've been talking, and we think it's time you moved somewhere special, a place where professionals can take care of you." The words didn't make sense at first, like hearing a language I almost understood, but not quite. My smile faltered. "What are you talking about? I take care of myself just fine." Paul leaned back, his eyes cool. "It's for the best. Sunset Haven has great facilities, medical staff, activities." "I don't need activities," I snapped. "I have a home." Helen's eyes flicked away just for a second, but I saw something there. Guilt, fear, calculation. "This isn't about you falling on the ice last month," I said slowly. "This is about the house, isn't it?" "No," she said quickly, but her voice wavered. "We just want you to be safe." The roast on the table seemed to shrink before my eyes, its steam curling upward like a ghost. I remembered the way I had turned down a proposal from a kind man named Walter when Helen was 12, because I couldn't bear to uproot her from the only home she'd known. He had offered me stability, companionship, love. But I'd chosen to keep my world small so hers could be secure. I remembered standing in the cold, watching her board the bus to college, waving until my arm ached, feeling both pride and the hollow echo of an empty house. Every sacrifice had been worth it, I told myself, because she would always be my daughter. But now she sat in my kitchen, dismantling the life I'd built for us with the calm efficiency of a stranger. Paul slid a set of papers toward me. "You'll need to sign these so we can get things moving. The place we found is in high demand." I stared at the lines of text swimming on the page, the legal language like barbed wire meant to corral me into a corner. The air seemed to thin. "This is Valentine's Day," I said softly. "You came here to tell me you're putting me away?" Helen's jaw tightened. "It's not like that." "Oh, it's exactly like that." My voice trembled, not from fear, but from the weight of every memory pressing against my ribs. For a flicker of a second, I saw the little girl she once was. The one who'd run to me with scraped knees, who'd whispered secrets under the covers during thunderstorms. But that child was gone, replaced by a woman who couldn't even look me in the eye as she signed me out of my own life. I pushed the papers back toward Paul. "No." He didn't flinch. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way." Somewhere inside me, the hope I'd been holding all day crumbled. The candle on the table sputtered, casting shadows across their faces. And in that moment, I realized this wasn't a conversation. It was a verdict. The dinner I'd poured my heart into sat untouched, cooling on the table between us, the rosemary scent now tinged with something bitter. Betrayal. The silence between us thickened, stretching like glass about to shatter. Paul tapped the stack of papers with one finger, his tone turning sharp. "Margaret, you slipped on the ice last month. You could have broken your hip. What happens if you fall again and no one's here to help you?" "I got up just fine," I said, my voice like stone. "And I have neighbors who check in on me. I'm not helpless." Helen leaned forward, her eyes soft, but her voice carefully measured. "Mom, you don't see what we see. You're not the same as you were. You forget things. You get tired more easily." I laughed, but there was no humor in it. "Of course I get tired. I'm 65, not 25. That doesn't mean I can't live in my own home." Paul pushed the folder closer. "Sunset Haven is perfect for you. And this house..." He glanced around with the cool appraisal of someone sizing up an investment. "It's too much work for you now. We could sell it. Use the money to make sure you're comfortable for the rest of your life." There it was, the slip of truth beneath all their polite language. "Sell it," I repeated slowly, the word tasting like ashes in my mouth. Helen avoided my gaze, pretending to adjust the papers. "It's just logical. You don't need all this space." "This is my home," I said, my voice tightening. "Every brick, every nail, every photo on these walls. This is my life. You don't get to take it from me." Paul's lips pressed into a thin line. "We're not taking it from you. We're securing your future." "By erasing my past?" My voice cracked, the weight of 40 years pressing down on me. For a moment, Helen's face softened. I hoped she might waver. But then Paul's hand landed on hers, grounding her back into whatever plan they'd been plotting. "We've already made arrangements," he said smoothly. "All we need is your signature. We can move you in by the weekend." I shook my head. "No, absolutely not." Paul's smile didn't reach his eyes. "Then we'll have to involve the county. They can declare you unfit to live alone. It will be much more difficult that way, Margaret. Best to cooperate." The threat hung in the air like smoke. My hands clenched in my lap. Every instinct told me to stand my ground, to throw them out. But a flicker of doubt whispered, what if they could? What if they had the power to force me out? "This is wrong," I said finally, "and you know it." Helen stood, her chair scraping against the floor. "We're doing this because we care. You might not see it now, but you will." I rose to meet her, my knees stiff but my spine unbending. "You call this care? No, this is convenience. This is greed dressed up as concern." Paul gathered the papers with precise movements, tucking them back into the folder. "We'll be back tomorrow morning, 9 o'clock. Have a bag packed." "I won't be here," I said, my voice low. His smirk was the only answer before they walked out the door. The moment the latch clicked, I felt the walls of my home press in around me, not with comfort, but with the weight of impending loss. I stood in the doorway long after their car disappeared down the street, my reflection faint in the glass. A woman who had given everything, now being told she had nothing left worth keeping. I glanced toward Robert's photo on the mantel. "They think they can push me out," I whispered, "but they've forgotten who I am." The candle on the table still flickered, casting its light over the untouched roast, the polished silverware, the wine waiting to be poured, a Valentine's dinner for 3, reduced to 1. I pulled out a chair and sat, eating in silence. Every bite was fuel for the resolve hardening in my chest. They could try to take my house, my freedom, but I would not hand them my dignity. I sat at the table long after the door closed, the quiet pressing in on me like a heavy coat I couldn't take off. My eyes drifted to the folder they'd left behind in their haste. A corner of it stuck out from beneath a placemat, the metal clasp catching the light. Curiosity wrestled with dread, but in the end, my fingers moved on their own. I slid the papers out, the thick scent of printer ink rising as I spread them across the table. The first page was exactly what they'd claimed, a consent form for admission to Sunset Haven, cold clinical language promising safety and professional care. But as I flipped through, my breath caught. Power of attorney. Full irrevocable control over my finances, property, and personal decisions. And there, halfway down the page, was my signature. Except it wasn't. The loop of the M in Margaret was wrong, the slant of the G too sharp. It looked like me, almost perfectly, but I knew my own hand. I gripped the paper, feeling the edges bite into my skin. My signature forged, my rights already stolen before I'd even been told. The next document made my stomach twist harder, a property transfer form listing Helen as the sole owner of my house, effective upon residency change. The date had been left blank, ready to be filled in the moment I was gone. My hands shook. I wanted to believe this was some misunderstanding, that maybe Helen hadn't seen all the details, that Paul had manipulated her into this. But the signatures, the prepared forms, they spoke of planning, of time, of intent. A creak on the porch made me freeze. I turned toward the front window just in time to see their car back up slowly, Paul in the driver's seat. He was talking animatedly, gesturing toward my house with one hand, the other resting casually on the wheel. Through the glass, I couldn't hear the words, but I could read the shape of his mouth. Kitchen wall, open space, new cabinets. My heart went cold. He wasn't just imagining my home without me, he was redesigning it. I set the papers down and rose, moving through the house in a daze. That's when I noticed it. The silver-framed wedding photo of Robert and me, gone from the mantel. The quilt my mother had sewn for our wedding, missing from the back of the sofa. The small wooden box Robert had carved during his first year working at the factory, no longer on the bookshelf. I checked the china cabinet, a gap where the teapot from our honeymoon in Charleston had always sat. It wasn't just the big things they wanted, they had already started stripping the small ones, the pieces of my life that held no market value but every ounce of my heart. The realization hit with such force I had to grip the edge of the table to steady myself. This wasn't sudden. This wasn't a decision made over coffee yesterday morning. This was a plan that had been unfolding quietly, like rot beneath the floorboards, while I'd been setting the table and believing my daughter still loved me. The hope I'd clung to, that this was a misunderstanding, that maybe they thought they were helping, crumbled into dust. They weren't helping. They were erasing me. I looked again at the papers, at the signature that wasn't mine. A deep, shaking breath filled my lungs, then left in a slow exhale. All right, I whispered to Robert's photo, though it was no longer there. If they want to fight, they'll get one. But as the words left my mouth, the weight of what I faced pressed down harder. They had already forged documents. They had already taken my things. They had the arrogance to plan the color of my kitchen walls before I'd even left the house. And they were my own blood. The candle on the table burned low, the flame small but steady. My eyes fixed on it. Maybe they thought they'd snuffed me out already, but I knew better. I'd been through worse storms than this. Still, as I gathered the papers into a neat stack, my chest ached with something heavier than anger. Betrayal cuts deep when it comes from a stranger, but when it comes from the child you raised with your bare hands, it cuts all the way to the bone. The van smelled faintly of antiseptic and old vinyl. I sat rigid in the back seat, my small overnight bag clutched like a lifeline on my lap. The movers had already come and gone, their heavy boots echoing through the hallways of my home as they boxed up what they deemed essentials. I had argued, pleaded, but it was like shouting into the wind, my words carried away, unheard. Paul drove ahead in his car with Helen beside him, the two of them silhouettes framed by the winter light. I watched their brake lights flash at each stop, wondering if they'd even glance in the rear-view mirror to see if I was still there. Sunset Haven loomed at the end of a long, winding drive. Red brick, white trim, a neat lawn that tried too hard to look inviting. A sign out front declared compassionate care for your loved ones. The words stung like a cruel joke. Inside, the air was a mixture of disinfectant and reheated food. A man with a clipboard introduced himself as Eric Palmer, the facility manager. His smile was wide, practiced, and completely devoid of warmth. "Mrs. Whitfield, welcome. We've been expecting you," he said, gesturing toward a hallway lined with closed doors. "I'm not staying here," I replied, but my voice sounded small, even to my own ears. Helen's hand squeezed my arm, not in comfort, but in quiet warning. "Let's get you settled, Mom." My room was at the end of the hall, beige walls, a narrow bed, a single window overlooking the parking lot. My few belongings were already there, placed in ways that made them look foreign, like artifacts in a display case. "You'll have everything you need," Eric said, standing in the doorway. "Meals at 6, medications at 8, visiting hours until 9. If you have any concerns, just let the staff know." The door clicked shut behind them, leaving me alone in the stillness. I sat on the bed, staring at the photo of Robert that had been set on the nightstand. His smile, frozen in time, was both a comfort and a reminder of everything I'd lost. Days blurred together quickly. Mornings began with the clatter of breakfast trays, afternoons with the low murmur of a television in the common room. Faces passed by, some blank, some tired, some too lost in their own thoughts to notice me at all. I waited for Helen to call. At first I told myself she was busy. By the second week, I stopped checking the phone. No letters, no visits, no familiar footsteps in the hall. The staff were polite enough, but their kindness felt like the automatic kind reserved for everyone here, as though we were all simply boxes to be ticked off on a daily checklist. The loneliness settled in slowly like water seeping under a closed door. It wasn't loud or sudden, it just was. I found myself lingering by the window, watching cars pull in and out of the parking lot, hoping one of them might be hers. One evening, I sat in the dining hall, pushing peas around my plate, when a man across from me spoke. "First week?" he asked. "Third," I replied. "They stopped visiting after the first," he said with a shrug. "Most of the time, anyway." I wanted to tell him he was wrong, that my daughter was different, but the words wouldn't come. The nights were the worst. The silence was thick, broken only by the hum of the heating unit and the occasional creak of the building settling. I lay awake staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment that had led me here, every sacrifice, every late-night shift, every missed chance at happiness for the sake of my daughter. And now, here I was, forgotten. I thought of the missing items from my home, the forged papers, the smug glint in Paul's eyes. They had planned this for longer than I'd realized, and now they had exactly what they wanted, me out of the way. But as the days stretched into weeks, I began to feel something beneath the grief and isolation, a slow-burning ember, faint but steady. They might have succeeded in moving me here, in cutting me off from the world I knew, but they hadn't broken me. Not yet. It was on the 12th day that I noticed them, the three who didn't shuffle aimlessly through the halls or stare blankly at the television. They sat together at a table near the big bay window in the common room, speaking in low voices. Curiosity tugged at me. That day after lunch, instead of returning to my room, I walked over. "You look like someone who doesn't belong here either," the woman said. Her silver hair was neatly pinned back, and her eyes were sharp in a way that felt familiar. "Evelyn," she introduced herself. "Margaret," I replied. The two men beside her nodded. One was tall and lean, with hands that still bore the roughness of labor. Thomas. The other sat with an upright dignity, his gaze calm but calculating. George. "What makes you say I don't belong here?" I asked. Because you still look like you're thinking about getting out, Thomas said simply. Most folks stop thinking that after the first month. They told me their stories in pieces, voices tinged with bitterness. Evelyn's son had convinced her to sign retirement planning documents that turned out to be a property transfer. Thomas had been pushed into signing over his auto shop to his daughter after she claimed it was for tax purposes. George's son had taken control of all his accounts while he was recovering from surgery, never giving them back. Each of them had been brought here under the guise of care. Each had watched their lives shrink down to a single room and a handful of possessions. I listened, my own story spilling out in return. The Valentine's dinner, the forged signature, the missing keepsakes. When I finished, Evelyn reached across the table, her fingers curling around mine. "You're not alone," she said firmly. It was a strange thing to feel hope stir here, in this place meant to smother it. These three, strangers hours ago, suddenly felt like allies, people who understood without me needing to explain the years behind my pain. For the first time since arriving, I didn't return to my room right away. We lingered, sharing coffee, watching the snow drift past the window. There was comfort in their company, a reminder that I wasn't the only one still fighting, even if we didn't yet know how. That night, I lay in bed with my mind turning over possibilities. Maybe together we could... What? Appeal to the management? Go to the police? It seemed impossible. But the ember of resistance burned a little brighter. The next afternoon, Thomas found me in the hallway, his expression tight. "Margaret, you need to see this." He led me to the staff lounge. Through the half-open door, I could see the computer screen, a real estate listing pulled up on the browser. My heart stuttered as my eyes locked onto the photo, my house. The headline above it read, "Charming family home, motivated seller, $198,000. It was worth at least twice that. The pictures felt like a violation. My kitchen counters cleared of the cookie jar Robert had bought me, the living room stripped of the quilt my mother made. Even the garden looked unfamiliar without the wooden bench I'd sat on for years. "Looks like they're moving fast," Thomas murmured. I couldn't breathe. The little bubble of hope I'd felt with Evelyn, Thomas, and George deflated, replaced by a hollow ache. "They've already taken it," I said quietly, though the sale hadn't closed yet. In my mind, the walls no longer belonged to me. They were just a set piece in someone else's life now. Evelyn appeared in the doorway, her face grim. "We'll find a way to fight this," she said, but the truth was, I couldn't imagine how. That night, the four of us sat in the common room, the television murmuring in the background. George spoke in his measured way, talking about patterns, about how this seemed like more than coincidence. Evelyn made notes in a small spiral-bound pad, listing the names of other residents who might have similar stories. I listened, nodding when appropriate, but my thoughts kept circling back to that real estate listing. The number, $198,000, burned into my mind. I'd planted roses along the walkway myself, painted every wall inside with my own hands, worked double shifts to keep the mortgage paid, and now it was being sold off like a bargain bin item in a clearance aisle. By the time I went to bed, I felt the familiar weight of despair pressing down again. Yes, I wasn't alone. But knowing others had been robbed didn't make the loss of my home hurt any less. Still, Evelyn's words lingered. "We'll find a way to fight this." Somewhere deep inside, I hoped she was right. The days after seeing my house listed for sale felt heavier than the first ones in Sunset Haven. I moved through the halls like a ghost, eating without tasting, speaking only when spoken to. Even Evelyn's sharp wit and Thomas's dry humor couldn't pull me from the fog. It was a Thursday afternoon when something shifted. I was sitting in the corner of the library, a small, seldom-used room with a few shelves of old paperbacks, flipping aimlessly through a gardening magazine. Most of the pages had been torn or folded, but one article caught my eye, "Reclaiming Abandoned Spaces." The author wrote about bringing a neglected garden back to life, how a single stubborn rosebush had survived years of weeds and neglect, still blooming despite everything. I read the sentence twice. Even in the harshest conditions, resilience finds a way. My fingers tightened around the page. For weeks, I'd been telling myself I was powerless, that I had been shoved into this place to wither away. But the truth was, I wasn't dead yet, and as long as I could think, speak, and move, I still had value. That thought alone sparked something. I closed the magazine and sat up straighter, the old stiffness in my back protesting but not stopping me. My mind began to turn over what I knew. The forged documents, the missing possessions, the conversations with Evelyn, Thomas, and George. These weren't just isolated wrongs. They were pieces of a bigger pattern. Patterns could be tracked, and tracked patterns could be exposed. That evening, I joined the others in the common room, but instead of sitting quietly, I leaned forward and lowered my voice. "We've been telling each other our stories," I said. "It's time we start collecting them properly." Evelyn's eyes sharpened. "You mean, keep records?" "Yes," I said. "Dates, names, documents if we can get them. We've all been treated like we're incapable of managing our own lives, but that's exactly what they want us to believe. If we act like we're helpless, they've already won." Thomas gave a slow nod. "And if we don't act like we're helpless, then we become dangerous," I replied. For the first time since I'd arrived, I felt a sense of control. It wasn't much, but it was something. We spent the next hour talking quietly, mapping out what we knew. Evelyn would note which residents had experienced suspicious relocations. Thomas would keep an eye on staff activity, especially in the office area. George, with his calm demeanor and good memory, would recall the conversations he'd overheard between administrators and visiting family members. As for me, I decided I would be the one to link it all together. I still had my mind, and I knew how to connect dots. Years of balancing bills, managing schedules, and running a household had made sure of that. Later that night, lying in my narrow bed, I felt a flicker of something I hadn't felt in months. Purpose. I didn't have to wait for someone to come and save me. I could start saving myself, and maybe others along the way. The next morning, I noticed something small but telling. Eric Palmer, the facility manager, was speaking to a well-dressed woman in the lobby. He held a thick envelope in one hand, tapping it lightly against his thigh. The woman was nodding, smiling in a way that looked more like relief than happiness. They shook hands, and she left quickly, her heels clicking on the tile. Eric turned and disappeared into his office. It was nothing more than a 30-second exchange, but I recognized the look in her eyes. It was the same look I'd seen in my own reflection the day I realized I was trapped here. Someone else had just lost something, and Eric had just gained something. That was the moment I knew we were right. This wasn't just family betrayal. It was a system, one that certain people here were profiting from. And if I could see it, I could prove it. By dinner that night, I'd already made up my mind. I wasn't going to sit by and hope for justice. I was going to make it happen. It happened late on a Saturday night, the kind of hour when the halls of Sunset Haven were quiet, except for the hum of the heating system and the muffled game show chatter from the common room. I couldn't sleep. My mind was buzzing with everything we'd discussed, the notes Evelyn had taken, the patterns George had pointed out. I decided to get a cup of tea from the small kitchenette down the hall. As I passed the administrative office, I heard a voice I knew too well. Paul's. Should have the listing closed in another week. The buyers already agreed to the reduced price. I froze. Eric's voice came next, low but smug. Make sure she doesn't get suspicious before the paperwork's done. This is number 50, Paul. You know I like to keep things clean. Number 50? My stomach turned. They had done this before, 49 times in fact, and I was the latest in their string of victims. Paul chuckled. You're a master at this, Eric. Honestly, I don't know how you get away with it every time. It's easy when nobody believes the victims, Eric replied. Old people don't fight back, and their families usually don't want to stir up trouble. The homes sell fast and everyone gets their cut. I pressed myself closer to the wall, my pulse hammering. My hand moved instinctively to the phone in my sweater pocket. I swiped to the voice memo app and hit record. "Just make sure my share comes through on time," Paul said. "Helen's already thinking about what she wants to do with the money." Eric laughed. "She'll have plenty. You're looking at over $100,000 after the split." My hand tightened around the phone. Every word was like a nail in the coffin they were building for me. But for the first time, I felt like I was prying the lid back open. The conversation ended with the sound of shuffling papers and a door closing. I slipped away, heart racing, back to my room. I sat on the bed and replayed the recording, the voices crisp and unmistakable. Hope surged through me. This was exactly the kind of proof we needed. This could be the moment that turned everything around. But then doubt crept in. Would anyone outside of here believe a recording made by a 65-year-old dementia patient? They could claim I'd misheard, misunderstood, or even fabricated it. And without documents to back it up, a clever lawyer could tear it apart. The high I'd felt began to dip, the edges of my confidence fraying. I turned to my nightstand drawer, pulling out a thin manila envelope I'd kept hidden since before Helen brought me here. Inside was a copy of my will, dated just 6 months ago. I'd made it quietly, without telling anyone, after sensing that Helen's visits had become less about me and more about my assets. In it, I had left my entire estate to the local veterans hospital, where Robert had once received care. Helen's name didn't appear anywhere except in the section explicitly stating she was to inherit nothing due to irreconcilable differences and financial irresponsibility. Nobody knew about this. Not Helen, not Paul, not even Evelyn, Thomas, or George. I stared at the document, a slow smile spreading across my face. It was my ace in the hole, the card I could play when the moment was right. If Helen and Paul thought they were about to inherit my home, they'd keep digging themselves deeper into their own fraud, and when they did, I'd be ready to pull the rug out from under them. The thought steadied me, pulling me out of the low that had threatened to swallow me. Yes, the recording alone might not be enough, but the combination of hard evidence, witnesses, and the will could be devastating. I tucked the envelope back into its hiding place and leaned back against the pillow. The embers of resolve that had begun to glow earlier that week now flared into something hotter, brighter. I didn't know exactly how we were going to do it yet, but I knew one thing for certain. I wasn't going to die in this place, stripped of everything I'd worked for. I was going to fight back, and this time, I had weapons of my own. The morning after my late-night discovery, I woke with a clarity I hadn't felt in months. The usual stiffness in my joints was still there, but beneath it was a sharper energy, a sense of purpose. I met Evelyn, Thomas, and George in our usual corner of the common room. The snow outside the big window was falling in slow, lazy spirals, but our conversation had nothing of winter's stillness. "I have something," I began, lowering my voice. "A recording. Paul and Eric. They admitted this is their 50th scheme." Evelyn's eyes widened. Thomas leaned forward, and George's lips pressed into a thin, satisfied line. "That's huge," Thomas said. "If we get the right person to hear it—" "It's not enough on its own," I interrupted. "They could claim I misunderstood. But if we combine it with other evidence—" George nodded. "We build a case, like in court. Each piece on its own might be questioned, but together they're undeniable." It was Evelyn who said the word none of us had dared to yet: lawyer. We all looked at one another. "There's a woman I know," Evelyn continued. "My neighbor's niece. She's a junior partner at a firm downtown. If I can get a message to her, she might help." The trick was, we couldn't let staff suspect we were plotting. We agreed to meet only in public spaces where it looked like casual conversation, and to mix our business talk with harmless small talk for cover. For the next week, we moved like shadows in our own routines. Thomas managed to slip into the office area during a fire alarm drill, memorizing the filing cabinet labels. George quietly befriended a new resident whose daughter had been making frequent visits to the front office. Another possible victim. Evelyn wrote letters in her spidery handwriting to her neighbor, slipping in coded mentions of garden projects that were really about our plan. My part was riskier. I began lingering near staff areas, carrying a crossword book so I looked occupied, but really listening for conversations, anything that hinted at financial transactions, property sales, or medical evaluations. I also started keeping a written log of dates and times whenever Helen or Paul called the facility. Late one afternoon, Evelyn slipped a folded piece of paper into my hand as we passed in the hallway. Inside was a name and a phone number, Rebecca Lane, Lane and Callaway LLP. She said if we can get to her office, she'll hear us out, Evelyn whispered. Getting to her office was the problem. None of us could simply walk out the front door without questions. That was when George surprised us all. "I still have a friend on the outside," he said one evening. "We served in the Navy together. He owes me a favor. He can come pick us up for a medical appointment. We take turns so it doesn't look suspicious." It was risky, but it was the best shot we had. We decided I would go first. My appointment would be with a cardiologist, true enough given my age, and from there, George's friend would take me straight to Rebecca's office. I would bring the recording, copies of my forged paperwork, and notes from our logs. The night before, I lay awake staring at the ceiling. This plan felt like the first real step toward taking my life back. I kept picturing Paul's smug grin, Helen's cool detachment, Eric's calculating eyes, and imagining their faces when they realized they were cornered. I also thought about the will locked away in my hiding spot. They had no idea it existed. That secret made me feel like I was already 2 moves ahead. The morning of the appointment, George's friend, a broad-shouldered man named Leonard, arrived at the facility. He greeted the staff warmly, joking about how he was finally dragging this stubborn woman to see her doctor. No one questioned it. As we drove away, I felt the weight of the building behind me, like a physical thing I was leaving in the rearview mirror. Rebecca's office was in a modest brick building downtown, the kind of place you might pass without noticing. She welcomed me in with a firm handshake and sharp eyes that missed nothing. "Evelyn told me a little," she said once we were seated, "but I want to hear it from you." I told her everything. From the Valentine's dinner to the forged signature, from the missing heirlooms to the real estate listing. Then I played her the recording. She sat very still, tapping a pen against her notepad. "This," she said finally, "is bad for them. Very bad. But you're right. It's not enough by itself. We'll need documents, witnesses, and proof of the pattern." I handed her the copies of my papers, our logs, and the names of the other residents with similar stories. Her eyes narrowed. "If what you're telling me is accurate, this isn't just one family's scheme, it's systemic, which means we could go to law enforcement with it." Hope surged in me again. "I'll start pulling property records," she continued, "and I'll discreetly reach out to a contact in the state attorney's office. But you need to keep gathering evidence. The more we have, the harder it is for them to wriggle out." I left her office feeling lighter than I had in months. The plan was in motion now, and not just among the 4 of us. There was someone on the outside, someone with the tools to make this count. When Leonard dropped me back at Sunset Haven, I walked in with my head high. No one had to know what I'd been doing. As far as they were concerned, I'd just been to a doctor's appointment. But in my mind, I'd taken the first step toward freedom. For a few days after my meeting with Rebecca, I moved through Sunset Haven with the quiet confidence of someone who knew she was on the verge of winning. Every shared glance with Evelyn, Thomas, and George felt like part of a silent victory march. The walls no longer seemed to press in quite as much, but confidence can make you careless. It was Tuesday afternoon, and I was in the library with Thomas, copying down dates from the visitor log while he kept watch. We'd done it a dozen times without incident. Then, just as I slipped the notebook into my sweater, I caught sight of Eric standing in the doorway. His eyes swept over the room, lingering on us for a fraction of a second too long before he turned away. That night, George came to my room looking grim. "It's Harold," he said. Harold was a newer resident who had started lingering near our group in the common room. We'd let him listen in a few times, thinking he might be another victim. "He went to Eric," George continued. "Told him you've been snooping around, talking about lawyers." The blood drained from my face. If Eric suspected we were building a case, he could start destroying evidence immediately. The next day confirmed my fear. I walked past the administrative office and saw Eric and a junior staffer moving boxes of files into a back room, their voices low and urgent. Later, I overheard the shredder whirring for hours. That night, Evelyn, Thomas, and George met in my room. The tension was sharp enough to taste. "They're cleaning house," Thomas said. "If we lose those files..." "We won't," I cut in. I reached under my bed and pulled out an old shoebox. Inside were USB drives, 7 of them, each containing scans of the most important documents we'd found so far. Property listings, forged signatures, the visitor log, even a few email printouts Thomas had managed to slip from the office printer. "I've been making copies," I said. "Rebecca has one set already. These are backups." The relief in the room was palpable. Evelyn exhaled. "You sly fox. You didn't trust even us with that?" "Not trust," I corrected. "Protect. If they got to one of us, they wouldn't get to all of us." That moment of safety, though, was short-lived. Eric began prowling the halls more often, his casual smiles hiding something sharper. He lingered by the common room door, glanced too long at the papers we held. It was clear Harold's betrayal had put him on alert. We tightened our operation, speaking in half sentences, passing notes instead of talking when possible. It was during one of those tense afternoons, watching snowflakes swirl outside the window, that a memory hit me so hard it made my eyes sting. Helen had been 6, and we were living in a 2-room apartment above a laundromat. Money was so tight I sometimes skipped meals so she could eat. One winter, the heating broke, and the landlord refused to fix it quickly. Helen had been curled on the couch under 3 blankets, shivering. I remembered wrapping her in my coat and walking with her 3 miles through the snow to the public library, not just for warmth, but because it was the only place I could sit and think without her seeing my fear. I had sat at a table in the children's section, watching her read, and told myself, "You can't give up. Not now. Not ever." We'd survived that winter. I'd picked up extra shifts, found a better apartment by spring. That resolve, the same grit that had carried me through those years, was what I needed now. Back in the present, I looked at Evelyn, Thomas, and George. "We're not slowing down," I said firmly. "If anything, we push harder. Harold may have set us back, but he hasn't stopped us." Rebecca's advice echoed in my mind. The more you have, the harder it is for them to wriggle out. We decided to accelerate our timeline. Leonard would pick up Thomas next, then Evelyn, each of them making their own trips to Rebecca's office with additional evidence. I'd keep watching Eric and Paul, waiting for them to slip again because they would. People like that always do, and when they did, we'd be ready. The day of the hearing dawned crisp and cold, the kind of winter morning that makes every sound sharper. Leonard drove me and Rebecca to the courthouse, her briefcase heavy with weeks of evidence, recordings, forged documents, real estate listings, and sworn statements from Evelyn, Thomas, and George. As we walked through the courthouse doors, I could feel the weight of the past months pressing on my shoulders. Every sleepless night, every quiet act of defiance, every whispered plan in the common room, it had all led to this. Helen and Paul were already seated at the defendant's table when we entered. Helen's hair was perfect, her suit expensive, but there was a tightness around her eyes that betrayed the truth. Paul wore his usual smirk, but it faltered when he saw me walk in with my head high. Judge Morrison, a stern woman in her 60s, called the court to order. Rebecca opened with a calm, steady voice that carried across the room. "Your Honor, this is not a case of misunderstanding between family members. This is a calculated act of elder exploitation involving forged medical evaluations, fraudulent real estate sales, and a network of accomplices." She played the recording of Paul and Eric discussing their 50th job, and the room went still. Helen's face drained of color. Paul's jaw tightened. Then came the forged documents, side-by-side comparisons of my real signature and the crude imitation they'd used. The visitor logs showing weeks without a call from my daughter. The listing for my home, underpriced and described as vacant due to family relocation. Evelyn, Thomas, and George each took the stand. They spoke not just for me, but for themselves and the others who had been victims of similar schemes. Their stories painted a pattern too clear to ignore. Paul tried to defend himself, blaming financial pressures and claiming he only wanted to secure Margaret's future. Helen, through tears, insisted she was worried about her mother's health. Rebecca didn't flinch. "Worry does not justify fraud," she said. "Concern does not excuse theft." By the time the closing statements ended, I felt a strange calm settle over me. Whatever the verdict, the truth had been laid bare. Judge Morrison's ruling was firm. All forged documents are hereby null and void. Full ownership of the property and all personal belongings is returned to Margaret Collins. Helen Collins and Paul Warren are found guilty of conspiracy to commit fraud, elder exploitation, and document falsification. Sentencing will be determined at a later date. The gavel came down, and it was over. Helen didn't look at me as she left the courtroom. Paul muttered something under his breath, but I didn't care enough to catch it. I wasn't here for reconciliation. I was here to reclaim myself. 2 weeks later, I stood in my own kitchen, the scent of rosemary and garlic filling the air. The dining table gleamed under the soft light set for 4. Evelyn, Thomas, and George were due any minute. The house looked different now, some furniture gone, replaced with pieces that felt lighter, freer. I'd hung Dorothy's photograph in the hallway, right where the morning sun touched it. The boxes from storage were mostly unpacked, each familiar item returned to its place. I moved through the rooms, touching the walls, the furniture, the life I had fought to win back. It wasn't just a house, it was proof that I hadn't been erased. When the doorbell rang, I opened it to the laughter of my friends, their arms full of wine, dessert, and the kind of joy you only share with people who've walked through fire with you. We ate for hours, the conversation weaving between the absurdities of life at Sunset Haven, the progress of other residents' cases, and lighthearted debates over the best pie crust recipe. At one point, Evelyn raised her glass. "To Margaret," she said, "for proving that age doesn't make you weak, it just makes you smarter about where to strike." The others clinked glasses with me, and for the first time in a long time, I felt the warmth of belonging without the sting of betrayal. Later, after the dishes were washed and my friends had gone home, I sat in my armchair by the window, watching snow fall over the garden. I thought of Helen, not with bitterness, but with a quiet acceptance. She had made her choice. I had made mine. Freedom, I realized, isn't always loud or celebrated. Sometimes it's just the peace of knowing you're safe, surrounded by people who choose to stand by you, not because they have to, but because they want to. And that, I thought as I sipped the last of my wine, was the greatest victory of all. The courtroom was nearly silent as Rebecca approached the bench with one final document in her hand, a sealed envelope she had kept hidden until now. "Your Honor," she said, "we have one last piece of evidence relevant to both the charges and the motive behind them." Judge Morrison gestured for her to proceed. Rebecca broke the seal and unfolded the paper. "This is Margaret Collins's most recent will, executed 6 months ago, properly witnessed and notarized." She glanced toward Helen and Paul before continuing. It specifies that upon her passing, all property and assets will be bequeathed to the Widowed Women's Support Foundation, a registered nonprofit. The air in the room shifted instantly. Helen's head jerked up. What? That's not possible. Paul leaned forward, his voice rising. You mean to tell me we... Rebecca didn't flinch. Yes, Mr. Warren. Every action you took, the fraud, the forged documents, the attempt to sell her home, was in pursuit of property that was never going to belong to you. The judge studied the will carefully, then looked over her glasses at the defendants. Is this accurate, Miss Collins? Yes, Your Honor, I said, my voice steady. I made that decision after realizing that my daughter and her husband valued my possessions more than my life. I decided my home could do more good in the hands of women who've known the kind of loss I have, but who still need a place to start over. Helen's face went pale, then red, then pale again. Paul muttered something under his breath that sounded like a curse. Judge Morrison's gavel came down sharply. Given this new evidence, the defendant's motive is rendered moot. However, their actions still constitute conspiracy, elder exploitation, and fraud. Bailiffs, take them into custody. The two officers moved quickly. The clink of handcuffs echoed through the room as Helen began to sob openly, her tears now laced with panic. Paul struggled against the officers, his voice breaking into shouts, but the sound faded as they were led out the side door. I didn't watch them go. Instead, I kept my eyes on Rebecca, who gave me the faintest nod. We had done it. The official paperwork took weeks, but the day finally came when I signed over the deed to my home to the Widowed Women's Support Foundation. The director, a warm-faced woman named Clara, thanked me with tears in her eyes. You're not just giving us a house, she said. You're giving women a safe place to breathe, to rebuild, to believe in themselves again. Her words settled into me like sunlight. I had fought to reclaim what was mine, but I didn't need to keep it to feel victorious. My victory was knowing I could choose, on my own terms, where my life went from here. I used the proceeds from selling a few personal antiques to rent a charming little cottage on the edge of town. It wasn't grand, but it had a sunny kitchen, a small garden, and enough room for guests. On the first Friday night after moving in, I hosted a dinner. Evelyn brought her apple pie, Thomas carried in 2 bottles of red wine, and George arrived with a bouquet of fresh flowers. We sat around my new dining table, secondhand but sturdy, laughing and talking as though we had been friends for decades. The conversation flowed easily. Updates on the other residents' legal battles, plans for Evelyn to volunteer at the library, Thomas's latest woodworking project, George's stories about his late wife. At one point, Evelyn raised her glass to Margaret, who showed us that even when people try to erase you, you can come back stronger than ever. We all clinked glasses, the sound ringing warm and clear. Later, as we lingered over dessert, I looked around the table and felt something deep and certain settle in my chest. I had lost a daughter in every way that mattered, but I had gained a family of choice. People bound not by blood, but by loyalty, respect, and the shared knowledge of what it means to be underestimated. After everyone left, I stepped out into the cool night air. The garden soil was dark and rich, ready for spring planting. Above me, the stars were scattered bright across the sky. Inside, the house still smelled of roast chicken and pie, the warmth of the evening lingering in every corner. I thought of the women who would soon walk through the doors of my old home, finding safety there the way I had found it here. A quiet smile touched my lips. Victory didn't need applause. Sometimes it was enough to know that in the end, you had written your own ending and made it better than anyone expected.